Vivian, a well-known and professional prostitute in the town, begins to attend church more and more often, not entirely for spiritual reasons, but because she is drawn to a pastor named Chidi in a way she can't fully understand. Pastor Chidi, while committed to his unwavering faith and work for God, starts noticing Vivian's presence more in the church than he should. A forbidden attraction and affection starts to build between them. Pastor Chidi lost control of himself one evening after a church service, giving in to his physical desires, at his sight on Vivian. What she wore on that day was something extraordinary, her curvaceous figure showing massively. Pastor Chidi wanted to leave for home, but he couldn't. His feet felt like they were rooted to the ground. He knew approaching Vivian was wrong, but the pull was too strong. His heart pounded in his chest as he watched her. When she caught his eye and gave him a small, knowing smile, it was over. He found himself walking toward her, every step a betrayal of everything he preached. He had fought so hard to remain faithful, but in that moment, every ounce of willpower was crumbling. Unknowingly to him, one of the church elders was watching from a corner. Before that day, Vivian sat at the edge of her worn-out bed, her reflection staring back at her from the cracked mirror on the wall. Her once bright, hopeful eyes now seemed dull, weighed down by years of living a life that had turned her cold. The streets had shaped her into someone she barely recognized. She had been working as a prostitute for nearly a decade, and any shred of innocence or belief in a better future had vanished long ago. The men she serviced saw her as nothing more than a sex object, and that's how she had come to see herself. It wasn't always this way. There was a time when Vivian dreamed of more love, a family, a normal life. But life had different plans. She had learned that hope was a dangerous thing. It was easier to numb herself, to accept her role in this world as something less than human. She stopped expecting kindness from others and even from herself. But one night, everything changed. As she made her way home from her usual night of work, the bright lights of a large church caught her attention. The sound of singing, followed by a deep, powerful voice, drifted out into the street. Something about the sound drew her in, and before she realized it, Vivian found herself standing at the entrance of the church. Inside, the congregation swayed to the rhythm of the choir, their faces lit with a kind of joy that Vivian had almost forgotten existed. At the altar stood a tall, commanding figure, Pastor Chidi. His voice rang through the room with authority as he spoke of redemption and salvation. Vivian couldn't explain why, but she felt her heart race. His words stirred something deep inside her, something long buried. She slid into a long fixed bench at the back, hoping not to be noticed. For the first time in years, she allowed herself to listen, really listen, to someone speak about a life beyond this one, about redemption. Vivian shook her head, laughing quietly at herself. What business did she have in a place like this? But no matter how much she wanted to walk out, her legs wouldn't move. As the service ended and people began to file out, Vivian made a quick exit. She didn't look back, but Pastor Chidi's words echoed in her mind as she made her way back to her small, lonely apartment. She tried to push the thoughts aside. This life wasn't meant for someone like her. She had chosen her path, and it was far too late to change that now. But lying in bed that night, unable to sleep, Vivian found herself thinking about the church, about Pastor Chidi. There was something in his voice that she couldn't shake, something that made her wonder if, maybe, just maybe, there was still hope for her after all. Pastor Chidi sat in his small office at the back of the church, his hands folded together as he stared out the window into the night. He had just finished one of his most intense sermons, his voice still raw from the emotion he poured into his message. His church had grown over the years, and he was proud of the work he had done. Every Sunday, people from all walks of life came to hear him speak, seeking the guidance and faith that he offered. But tonight, something felt different. Among the familiar faces in the crowd, there had been someone new, a woman sitting alone in the back. She didn't look like the others. Her clothes were different, her posture defensive. He hadn't seen her before, but her presence had pulled at his attention in a way that unsettled him. Pastor Chidi prided himself on being a man of unwavering faith, someone who could guide even the most lost souls back to the light. But the look in this woman's eyes had stirred something in him he hadn't expected. He shook his head, pushing the thought aside. It was his job to help people, and this woman, whoever she was, clearly needed help. As he went home and prepared for bed that night, he couldn't stop thinking about her. He knew the city was full of people like her, broken, searching for something more. But there was something different about her, something that tugged at him in a way that felt both dangerous and intriguing. The next day, as Pastor Chidi sat in his office going over the notes for his next preaching, he found his thoughts drifting back to her. He didn't even know her name, but her face was imprinted in his mind. This was wrong, he told himself. He was supposed to be focused on saving souls, not becoming distracted by one of them. He picked up his Bible, hoping to find solace in its pages, but even that didn't stop the nagging feeling that he wished he would see her again. And he did. That very Sunday, she returned, sitting in the same spot at the back of the church. His eyes found hers, and for the first time in his life, Pastor Chidi felt a pull that had nothing to do with faith. Vivian's visits to the church became more frequent. She would sit quietly in the back, barely interacting with anyone, her eyes always locked on Pastor Chidi as he spoke. She wasn't sure what kept drawing her back. Was it the hope he offered, or was it something deeper? Her life had been void of real connection for so long that the mere presence of someone like him felt like a lifeline, even if she couldn't fully understand why. At first, she convinced herself that she was coming for the preachings, for the chance to feel something beyond the numbness that had overtaken her life. But the more she listened, the more she realized that it wasn't just the words she craved. It was him. The way he moved, the way his voice carried through the room, the power he held over the congregation, it fascinated her. And it scared her. Vivian wasn't used to feeling vulnerable, and yet here she was, coming back week after week, drawn to a man who was supposed to be untouchable. She tried to push the thoughts away, reminding herself that she had no place in his world. But it was too late. The attraction had taken root. Pastor Chidi had noticed her too. Every time she came, he found his eyes drifting toward her, lingering a moment too long at her. He knew it was wrong. She was just another lost soul in need of guidance, like so many others who came to his church. But there was something different about her, something that unsettled him in ways he hadn't anticipated. One evening, after a particularly emotional service, after everybody had left, Vivian stayed behind. The church was empty, and she found herself standing at the front, staring up at the cross that hung above the altar. She didn't hear Pastor Chidi approach until he was right beside her. "Is everything all right?" he asked, his voice soft yet commanding. Vivian jumped slightly, her heart racing. I don't know," she admitted, surprised by her own honesty. "I feel like I don't belong here, but I keep coming back." Pastor Chidi studied her for a moment, his expression unreadable. "Everyone belongs here, pretty lady. No one is beyond redemption." She looked at him, her eyes filled with doubt. "You don't know me. You don't know what I've done." "I don't need to," he said, stepping closer. "What matters is what you choose to do now." There was a long pause, the kind that seemed to stretch time itself. Their eyes locked, and in that moment, the tension that had been building between them finally snapped. Before either of them could stop it, they found themselves moving toward each other, the space between them shrinking until it disappeared completely. The kiss was intense, filled with the passion and desperation of two people who had been denying their desires for far too long. Their affair began with a kiss, but it quickly developed into something neither Vivian nor Pastor Chidi could control. They met in secret, hiding their growing relationship from the world, knowing fully well the consequences if they were caught. For Vivian, the encounters with Pastor Chidi were unlike anything she had ever experienced. She enjoys his manhood in a way she couldn't fully understand. The men she had been with in the past saw her only as an object, but with him, it was different. There was passion, yes, but there was also tenderness, a tenderness that terrified her. And the guilt gnawed at her. She knew what they were doing was wrong, she had always lived on the edge of sin, but this felt different. She was dragging a man of God into her world, and the weight of it was becoming unbearable. Pastor Chidi was tormented as well. Every time he stood in front of his congregation, preaching about righteousness and resisting temptation, he felt like a hypocrite. How could he tell others to live a life of purity when he himself had fallen so far from grace? The guilt weighed heavily on him, but no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't stay away from her. The affair consumed them both, pulling them deeper into a web of secrecy and lies. Vivian would slip into the church after service hours, meeting Pastor Chidi, both in his office and home, their encounters growing more frequent and more dangerous. They knew they were playing with fire, but the desire was too strong to resist. Then, the rumors started. Mrs. Dada, a stern-looking old lady and a longtime member of the church, had noticed something off about Pastor Chidi. She had seen him meeting with a woman late at night, and the gossip began to spread. At first, the rumors seemed harmless. Many believed that Pastor Chidi was simply offering private counseling to someone in need. But as the whispers grew louder, Vivian and Pastor Chidi knew it was only a matter of time before their secret was exposed. The tension in the church grew with every passing day. The rumors about Pastor Chidi and the mysterious woman circulated like wildfire, and though some believed he was simply helping a troubled soul, others weren't so sure. Vivian could feel the walls closing in on her. She knew they couldn't keep this up much longer. Something had to give. One Sunday, after another prayer session filled with fire and brimstone, Vivian lingered at the church premises, her mind racing. She couldn't keep living like this, lying, sneaking around, pretending everything was fine. The guilt was eating her alive, and she couldn't take it anymore. As the congregation filed out, she found herself walking toward Pastor Chidi's office, her heart pounding in her chest. When she reached the door, she hesitated, her hand hovering over the handle. She wasn't sure what she was about to do, but she knew she couldn't keep running from the truth. She knocked softly, and a moment later, the door opened. Pastor Chidi stood there, his eyes widening in surprise when he saw her. "Vivian, what are you doing here?" he asked, his voice low and filled with concern. "I can't do this anymore," she said, stepping inside. "I can't keep living like this. It's tearing me apart. I need genuine redemption." Pastor Chidi closed the door behind her, his expression conflicted. "I know," he said quietly. "I've been struggling too. But what can we do? If anyone finds out..." "They're already suspicious," Vivian interrupted. "The rumors are spreading. It's only a matter of time before the truth comes out." Pastor Chidi ran a hand through his hair, clearly torn between his duty to the church and his feelings for Vivian. "What do you want to do?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Vivian took a deep breath. "I want to confess. I can't live with this guilt anymore." His eyes widened in shock. "Confess? To the whole congregation?" "It's the only way," she said firmly. "We can't keep hiding. It's time to face the consequences." Pastor Chidi was silent for a moment, his mind racing. He knew she was right, but the thought of confessing publicly terrified him. His reputation, his career, it would all be over. Without saying much more, they headed back to their separate homes, yet burdened by the weight of their secret. They walked away without looking back, words caught in their throats, both lost in their own worlds of turmoil. As Vivian returned to her small, dim apartment, the silence around her felt crushing. The reality of her choices pressed down on her, and for the first time, she allowed herself to feel the full extent of her guilt. She wanted to wash away the shame, to shed the layers of herself that had dragged her down this path, to find a true way to God and redemption. The life she had known suddenly felt hollow, her mistakes hanging around her like chains. And she knew that if she wanted redemption, real redemption, she would have to take responsibility, not only to herself but to God and the congregation. Across town, Pastor Chidi sat alone in his living room, the quiet ticking of the clock echoing in the background as he stared blankly at his Bible lying closed on the table. He had preached forgiveness, strength, and redemption, had poured his life into guiding others toward purity and faith, and yet here he was, at the lowest point he had ever known. Shame twisted inside him, a sharp, biting guilt that gnawed at his heart. Years of dedication, commitment, and faith, he could feel it all slipping away, like sand through his fingers. He had allowed himself to fall for desires he had long thought buried. The thought of Vivian's confession hung in his mind, taunting him. Could she really go through with it? Did she truly have the courage to expose everything? No, Vivian wouldn't have the boldness to expose such an act to the entire church. A part of him clung to the hope that she didn't mean those words, that she wouldn't be able to face the congregation and speak of their affair. The idea seemed too far-fetched, too impossible. After all, she had come to him seeking guidance, not ruin. And then, a strange, fleeting thought crossed his mind. Maybe, just maybe, there was a way out of this. Maybe he could convince her to keep quiet, to find another path, another way to seek redemption without tearing down his image and everything he had worked for. This glimmer of hope sparked within him, momentarily easing his guilt. He resolved to confront Vivian, to speak with her, to help her see reason. Surely, there had to be a way for them to escape this without sacrificing everything. As the hours slipped by, both Vivian and Pastor Chidi wrestled with their thoughts, each questioning their faith, their choices, and the path ahead. Neither knew what the future held, but in that quiet, heavy night, one thing was clear: this secret could not be hidden much longer. And both would have to face it, one way or another. The following Sunday, Vivian found herself sitting in her usual seat at the back of the church, her hands clenched tightly in her lap. Pastor Chidi's voice echoed through the hall, but his words seemed distant, muffled as if coming from underwater. She wasn't absorbing a single line of his preaching. Her mind was somewhere else, swirling with guilt, doubt, and a growing resolve. Today would be the day. As she sat there, her heart pounded louder than the preaching, each beat urging her forward. She knew this confession would shatter her life, unravel everything she had clung to. But she also knew she couldn't bear the weight of the secret any longer. She would confess everything to the congregation about the abominable act. Her gaze shifted to the altar, where Pastor Chidi was speaking passionately to the congregation. His eyes swept over the crowd, never lingering on her, and for a brief moment, she felt alone, separated from the warmth of the gathering. She whispered a silent prayer for courage, then took a deep breath, rising slowly from her seat. People around her turned, their eyes narrowing in confusion. Whispers floated in the air as she took her first step forward, and then another, her movement steady yet filled with purpose. As she walked towards the altar, her footsteps seemed to echo louder with each step, and the rustling of her clothes became the only sound she could hear. Pastor Chidi's words faltered as his gaze settled on her approaching figure. His expression shifted from calm to concern, his brow furrowing as he realized who was interrupting his preaching. He tried to maintain composure, but a faint hint of panic crossed his face. When Vivian reached the front of the church, she stopped directly before him. His voice dropped, barely a whisper. "Vivian, what are you doing?" Ignoring his words, Vivian met his eyes, her own gaze unwavering. She could feel the congregation's eyes on her, a sea of faces waiting to understand what was happening. She could feel their judgment even before a single word left her lips. "Please, Vivian, think this through," Pastor Chidi urged softly, trying to shield her from the impending storm. But she shook her head, the weight of her decision pressing down on her shoulders, her voice trembling as she finally spoke. "I have something to confess," she said, her voice breaking the stunned silence of the congregation. A collective gasp rippled through the crowd. Vivian's chest tightened, but she forced herself to continue. "I have sinned," she said, her voice steadier now, louder. She took a shaky breath, eyes darting around as if seeking courage from the very walls of the church. She glanced up at Pastor Chidi, whose face had paled, his hand gripping the edge of the pulpit. "Pastor Chidi and I," she struggled to continue, her voice catching. We've been having an affair." The shock in the room was palpable, a wave of whispers and gasps flooding the air as her confession landed like a thunderclap. Some members covered their mouths in disbelief, others shook their heads, and murmurs of betrayal surged through the congregation. Vivian felt herself shrink under the weight of their judgment but stayed rooted in place, her gaze steady as she faced the consequences of her truth. Pastor Chidi's head lowered in shame, his hands trembling as he absorbed her words. He could hardly look up, knowing that in that one moment, everything he had built, every words he had preached, every soul he had guided, it was all crumbling before him. Vivian swallowed hard, her voice shaking but resolute as she continued, each word pulling her deeper into the painful truth. She told them how she and Pastor Chidi had met, how their affair started with just a mere kiss, and how it escalated into something deeper, their secret meetings and romance. The church erupted in chaos after Vivian's confession. The once peaceful sanctuary became a battleground of whispered accusations and loud judgments. Pastor Chidi stood at the front of the room, his face pale and his hands shaking as he absorbed the weight of Vivian's words. He had known this moment was inevitable, but hearing the truth spoken out loud, exposed for all to see, was a different kind of pain. The congregation was divided. Some members, shocked and betrayed, demanded his immediate resignation. "How can he preach to us about righteousness when he's been living in sin?" one man shouted. Others were more sympathetic, calling for prayer and forgiveness, believing that even Pastor Chidi deserved redemption. Vivian, meanwhile, stood alone at the front of the church, her heart pounding as she faced the angry stares of the congregation. She had expected this reaction, but that didn't make it any easier. She knew she would be judged, possibly even shunned by the very people who were supposed to believe in forgiveness. But she also knew that this was the only way she could move forward. Pastor Chidi stepped down from his position that very day, addressing the congregation with a heavy heart. "I have failed you all," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I have failed myself, and most of all, I have failed God. I cannot continue to stand before you as your leader, not after the sins I've committed." The room was filled with a mix of shock, anger, and sorrow as Pastor Chidi walked away from the pulpit for the last time. Vivian watched him leave, her heart aching for the man she had come to care for, despite the circumstances. But she knew this was the beginning of the end for both of them. In the days that followed, Vivian was rejected by much of the church community. People whispered behind her back, casting judgment on her for leading their beloved pastor astray. But amid the rejection, she found solace in a small group of people who believed in her sincerity. They saw her confession not as a moment of shame, but as a step toward redemption. Pastor Chidi, on the other hand, struggled with the fallout of his actions. He had lost his position, his reputation, and his sense of purpose. But as the days passed, he began to see his fall from grace as an opportunity to rebuild, not as a pastor, but as a man. He no longer preached from a pulpit, but he used his experience to help others who were struggling with their own demons, offering guidance and understanding to those who, like him, had lost their way. For Vivian, the path to redemption was slow and painful. She continued to attend church, despite the glares and whispers, determined to find her way back to herself. She wasn't sure if she would ever fully escape her past, but she was determined to try. She had been broken for so long, but now, for the first time in years, she felt the faint stirrings of hope. Both Vivian and Pastor Chidi embarked on separate journeys of healing, their lives forever changed by the choices they had made. Their paths would never fully intersect again, but they each found their own way to redemption, learning that even the most flawed souls could be forgiven, and even the darkest of stories could find a glimmer of light. Please like and subscribe. It may look simple for you, but for us it's very valuable and it keeps us pushing to provide more interesting stories and tales, not just for your entertainment, but also for you to gain new experiences in life, to tackle new encounters. Thanks so much for your support.